One strong point of these US-backed anti-government protests here in Thailand is their social media game. It's something the mobs like to brag about, and it's something the Western corporate media likes to highlight. And they try to explain it as if it's because it's a youth movement, they're just better at using technology than the so-called old establishment. But this simply isn't true. The US funded anti government protests are so successful on social media because the US based social media networks they are using have tilted the entire game in their favor. For example, Facebook and Twitter have purged hundreds of pro government accounts for what they claim was inauthentic, coordinated behavior. They've used a similar excuse to delete all of my accounts, and they even block links to websites that are critical of the protests from even being shared on their platform. So it's no wonder the opposition has such a strong advantage when it comes to social media. People who are critical of them are being silenced by these US-based tech companies, and the protesters themselves are being given free rein on these networks. The use of US-based social media to advance US foreign policy goes back well over a decade to the years leading up to the US engineered Arab Spring. Take a look at this 2011 New York Times article titled US Groups Helped Nurture Arab Uprisings. And it says right here, a number of these groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House. And then the article explains that these organizations are in turn funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, US Congress, and it's all being overseen by the US State Department. The article also mentions a 2008 technology meeting the US-backed agitators attended in New York City. An official US State Department document detailing this meeting says they used how-to guides and tips on how to use social networking and other technologies to promote freedom and justice and counter violence, extremism, and oppression. The meeting included representatives from Facebook, Google, YouTube, and of course, the US State Department itself. And these agitators in 2011 openly used social media not to promote freedom and justice or to counter violence, extremism, and oppression, but to do the exact opposite. They've transformed every single country caught up in the Arab Spring into either a divided society with a failed economy at best, or an absolute war zone, or a failed state at worst. So the role of US-based social media giants being involved in US-backed regime change is no secret. It's admitted by the US media, it's admitted by the US government itself. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, this sort of training is still going on today, and the BBC itself admitted organizations like the Oslo Freedom Forum helped plan the chaos we saw recently in Hong Kong, China. And key Thai agitators were also at the same forum. This includes Pa Wit from Thanaton's Khalsat newspaper, anti-Chinese agitator Netawit, Rap Against Dictatorship, and even Thanaton himself, and that was as recently as this year. So there it is. The anti-government mob's social media game is so successful because their foreign sponsors have rigged US-based social media networks in their favor. Now, why are US-based social media companies so effective at manipulating people with their networks? Well, Facebook's own creators admit they made the platform deliberately addictive. Look at this London Guardian article. Ex-Facebook president Sean Parker, site made to exploit human vulnerability. And it says, Facebook's founders knew they were creating something addictive that exploited a vulnerability in human psychology from the onset. The article also mentions how the like button gave users a little dopamine hit to encourage them to upload more content. So the more likes you get, the more sort of that content you want to upload so that you keep the likes coming. And I think we all kind of understand just how addictive that can actually be. The article also points out that It's a social validation feedback loop, exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And it quotes Parker as saying, all of us are jacked into this system. All of our minds can be hijacked. Our choices are not as free as we think they are. So think about this. Not only are US trained agitators learning how to use social media to destabilize their own countries, and not only do US based social media networks boost their accounts while suppressing or entirely removing the accounts of their opponents, the network itself is set up to reward users who post specific content. And in Thailand's case, that's anti-government content and also anti-monarchy content. Facebook and Twitter reward this behavior not with money, but with addictive likes, shares, and retweets. And for some users, feeding their need for attention and their ego is as good or even better than paying them actual money to come out and protest. And at this point, many involved in the mobs, this is not about reasoning or principles. This is just an addiction deliberately created by US-based social media companies. So this is obviously a very huge problem. So what can nations like Thailand do about this? If it's an addiction, it's like trying to talk to somebody about not drinking, not doing drugs, not gambling. It's not going to work. You have to cut them off from whatever it is they're addicted to. And in this case, it's these US-based social media platforms that have been essentially weaponized against Thailand. And if we think about this, in the 19th century, if you had an army and a navy, you were able to protect your land borders and your shores. In the 20th century, when the airplane was invented, nations had to start thinking about how to defend their airspace. Now, in the 21st century, with the creation of the internet and social media, a nation's information space needs to be defended in the same way its physical territory and its airspace needs to be defended. And how do nations do this? Well, Russia and China have taken this threat seriously, and they've developed their own social media platforms. And they have either restricted or entirely banned foreign platforms like Google, Facebook, and Twitter from operating within their borders. Nations like Vietnam have also done this. They've begun moving Facebook, Google, and Twitter further under their control by forcing them to open up local offices and holding them directly accountable for any content on their platform that violates Vietnam's internet laws. Vietnam is also investing in its own alternative social media platforms, just like Russia and China have done. And eventually, these will replace US-based networks. But in the meantime, they serve as leverage over US-based tech firms, encouraging them to cooperate with the Vietnamese government or face expulsion. Not only does this protect a nation's information space, but it also keeps the enormous amount of money that social media networks make within a nation's own borders. So that means Thailand would keep all of this money instead of it going out to Silicon Valley in California. You also have to consider how local tech companies and social media platforms will encourage Thais to study and use their computer skills here in Thailand for Thailand's own economy and for Thailand's best interests, not Washington's. So Thailand needs to rein in these US social media companies, probably by first having them open their offices locally here, introducing joint ownership of their markets here in Thailand. But at the same time, Thailand needs to seriously invest in alternatives of its own. Together with cutting the funding to NGOs behind these protests, and just as China did in Hong Kong, Thailand can get at the very source of this current unrest and not just end the protests today, but they can end this sort of instability permanently. If you found this video useful, please like and share. If you subscribe to the channel, that helps the channel grow. And as always, thank you very much for watching.